Will you pretend to be my husband for just 24 hours? I never thought I'd be the kind of woman to corner a total stranger in a 5-star hotel lobby. But there I was, palms slick with sweat, heart thundering against my ribs, clutching my leather portfolio like it was a life raft in a storm. The invitation to my sister's wedding had been sitting on my kitchen counter for 6 weeks, a ticking bomb wrapped in cream-colored silk. Who invites their unsuccessful sister to a wedding just to rub her face in it? Someone who wants to win. Someone who wants to show the world that while I was busy building a career, they were busy building a dynasty. The envelope was heavy, embossed with gold, the kind of paper that screams you don't belong here. For 3 days it sat unopened. I already knew the sting it contained, the final insult from a family that always saw my independence as a defect. I could still hear my mother's voice at my last birthday, practiced and sharp. Naomi, you're smart but you're difficult. You're too much for a man to handle. The boundary between my pride and my pain had been blurry ever since. The man sitting across the lobby looked like the answer to every insult I'd ever endured. He wasn't just wealthy, though his watch probably cost more than my apartment. He had the kind of stillness that only comes from absolute power. He was Korean, with a presence that felt like a physical weight in the room. I'd been watching him for 20 minutes, building my courage, rehearsing a request that sounded more insane with every heartbeat. What kind of fool asks a stranger to lie for them? This kind. The kind who spent her life being told she was enough and was tired of believing it. The kind who couldn't bear the thought of walking into that ballroom alone, only to watch my sister smirk while everyone whispered about poor Naomi, who couldn't keep a man interested. That memory fueled my steps across the marble floor. If my family wanted to remind me of my place one last time, I would show up with a man who made them feel small. I just needed help to sell the illusion. When I finally approached him, interrupting his focus, I expected a cold dismissal. Instead, Kang Joon-Seok looked up. His obsidian eyes missed nothing. They stripped away my expensive coat and my practiced smile until all that was left was my desperation. I stammered through my proposal, offering money I knew he didn't need, my cheeks burning with a shame I couldn't hide. Will you be my husband for the wedding? The words hung in the air, pathetic and heavy. I'd rehearsed this moment 100 times, but nothing prepared me for the quiet, lethal calculation in his eyes as he looked at me. The silence in the hotel lobby was absolute, broken only by the steady, rhythmic ticking of the clock behind the reception desk. Joon-Seok didn't move. He didn't even blink. He simply set his fountain pen down with a deliberate metallic click that echoed against the marble floors. I felt like a bird trapped in the sights of a predator, my breath hitching as he leaned back in his leather armchair. I don't need your money, Naomi, he said, his voice a low-frequency vibration that seemed to settle deep in my bones. But I do have a use for a woman desperate enough to gamble her dignity on a stranger. He reached into the breast pocket of his charcoal blazer and pulled out a thin, silver-bordered card. He didn't hand it to me. He slid it across the polished mahogany table, forcing me to lean into his space to retrieve it. It wasn't a business card. It was a non-disclosure agreement with a single, handwritten line at the bottom. My condition is simple, he continued, his obsidian eyes locking onto mine with a terrifying intensity. For the next 24 hours your agency belongs to me, you will speak when I signal, you will smile when I touch you, and you will offer total, unquestioning obedience. To your family I am the husband who adores you, to me you are a partner in a high-stakes transaction. Do we have an accord? The word obedience felt like a cold blade pressed against my throat. It was a price I never thought I'd be willing to pay, but then I felt the weight of the wedding invitation in my purse. I thought of my sister's condescending smirk and the way my mother looked at me like I was a puzzle she had given up on solving. I was already drowning. Joon-Seok was simply the dark hand offering to pull me out, provided I didn't mind the grip. I picked up the pen. My fingers trembled, but my resolve was a jagged shard of glass. I signed my name at the bottom of the card, the ink bleeding slightly into the expensive paper. As soon as the final loop of my name was finished, Joon-Seok stood up. His height was a sudden, overwhelming shadow that commanded the air around us. He didn't offer a hand to help me up. He simply adjusted his signature watch and looked at me with a gaze that stripped away my defiance. The contract is sealed, he murmured, his voice devoid of warmth but heavy with a new, terrifying kind of intimacy. From this moment until midnight tomorrow you are mine. Now let's go. We have a lot of work to do before you're fit to be my wife. I was barely given a moment to process the weight of the word mine before Joon-Seok's world swallowed me whole. He moved with a predatory efficiency, leading me toward a private elevator that required a biometric scan. We rose in a silence so thick it felt like the oxygen was being squeezed out of the small space. When the doors slid open, I found myself in a penthouse suite that didn't just scream wealth, it whispered power. The air smelled of expensive lilies and fresh cedar, a scent that felt as cold and sterile as the man beside me. "Prepare her," Joon-Seok commanded. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the absolute weight of a king's decree. From the shadows of the foyer, 3 women dressed in silent, midnight black uniforms emerged like a precision strike team. They didn't greet me, they simply took my arms and guided me toward the dressing suite. I caught a glimpse of Joon-Seok in the mirrored wall as I was led away. He was pouring a glass of amber liquid, his eyes fixed on the city skyline, already indifferent to my presence now that the order had been given. For the next 4 hours I wasn't a woman, I was a project. I was scrubbed, polished, and sculpted with a clinical intensity that left my skin tingling. My natural hair, which I had spent years learning to love despite my mother's criticisms, was handled with a reverence that bordered on worship. They twisted and pinned it into an architectural masterpiece, weaving in sapphire-studded clips that caught the light like fallen stars. They applied my makeup with the delicacy of master painters, emphasizing the depth of my eyes until I looked like a woman who had never known a second of doubt. Then came the dress. It was a gown of heavy emerald silk that felt like liquid armor. As they zipped me into it, the fabric clung to my curves with a possessive precision, the plunging neckline and structured shoulders transforming my posture. When they finally stepped back, I stood before a floor-to-ceiling mirror and felt a jolt of genuine fear. The woman looking back at me was striking, regal, and utterly unrecognizable. Gone was the emotionally guarded freelancer from the hotel lobby. In her place was a woman who looked like she belonged at the right hand of a man like Joon-Seok. The doors behind me opened, and Joon-Seok stepped into the room. He had changed into a bespoke tuxedo that made him look like a shadow carved from stone. He walked a slow circle around me, his gaze trailing from the hem of my gown to the pulse point in my neck. He didn't offer a compliment. Instead, he reached out and adjusted a single stray lock of hair, his cold fingers lingering against my temple for a heartbeat too long. "The illusion is perfect, Naomi," he whispered, his eyes meeting mine in the reflection. "Just remember, it's only an illusion as long as you play your part." The heavy oak doors of the chapel swung open, and the air in the room seemed to vanish in a single, collective gasp. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but my fantasies were pale shadows compared to the reality of Joon-Seok's presence. He didn't just walk, he commanded the space, his hand resting on the small of my back with a proprietary weight that felt both like a shield and a shackle. As we stepped onto the cream-colored carpet of the aisle, the soft piano melody faltered, the musician's fingers skipping a beat as every head in the sanctuary turned. The silence wasn't just quiet, it was a physical weight, thick with the shock of my family and the hushed whispers of the elite circles they so desperately craved to join. I kept my chin parallel to the floor, my gaze fixed ahead, but I could feel the heat of 100 stares burning into the emerald silk of my gown. To my left I saw my mother. Her grip on her pearl necklace was so tight I thought the string might snap. Her jaw had dropped, her carefully applied mask of maternal disappointment crumbling into pure, unadulterated confusion. And then there was my sister. Standing at the altar in her pristine white dress, she looked less like a glowing bride and more like a woman who had just seen a ghost or a king. Her bouquet trembled in her hands, the lilies shaking as she realized that the difficult sister hadn't just shown up. She had arrived with a man who made her own groom look like an afterthought. Joon-Seok leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of my ear. His breath was warm, smelling of peppermint and something metallic, like the air before a lightning strike. "Don't look at them, Naomi," he whispered, his voice a low, lethal vibration meant only for me. "Look at the end of the room. You're the only woman here who isn't a guest. You're the main event." The power in his voice acted like a spine of steel, forcing my shoulders back and my head higher. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the outsider looking in, begging for a scrap of validation. I felt like the sun, and the rest of them were just planets caught in the gravity of the man at my side. We reached the front row, and as we sat, Joon-Seok didn't let go of my hand. He interlaced our fingers, his thumb tracing a slow, deliberate line over my knuckles. It was a gesture of profound intimacy, a performance so perfect it terrified me. As the priest began to speak, I realized the stakes had shifted. I had come here to survive a wedding, but as Joon-Seok's cold, obsidian eyes caught mine, I realized I was now part of a much more dangerous ceremony. The silence of the chapel wasn't a peace, It was the quiet before the first strike of a war I wasn't sure I could win. The chapel's stunned silence broke into a chaotic roar of whispers the moment we reached the reception hall. The air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of repressed jealousy. Joon-Seok moved through the crowd like a predator in a tuxedo, his hand never leaving the small of my back. He didn't just guide me, he shielded me, his body a silent barrier between me and the prying eyes of the guests. "Naomi, darling," my mother began, her voice sugared with a malice that didn't quite reach her eyes. She gripped her champagne flute so tightly I expected the crystal to shatter. She looked at Joon-Seok, her gaze scanning for a crack in his expensive armor, a sign that he was a fluke. "You never mentioned a husband, not even a whisper at Christmas. One has to wonder how such a complicated woman found someone of such stature so suddenly." She paused, her smile sharpening. "Or perhaps he's just a very dedicated business associate." I felt the familiar cold knot of inadequacy tighten in my chest, the old Naomi wanting to shrink away. But before I could falter, Joon-Seok leaned into the space between us. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 5 degrees. "The best things in life don't require an announcement, Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice a smooth, low-frequency vibration that commanded immediate silence from the nearby tables. "They require protection. Naomi didn't tell you because I prefer our private life to remain exactly that, private." He turned his gaze to me, his eyes softening into a look of such convincing, lethal devotion that even I felt a flicker of doubt. "Isn't that right, Butterfly?" My sister, the bride, joined the circle, her white train trailing behind her like a wounded bird. "It's just so curious," she prattled, her voice high and tight. "A CEO of your reputation, Joon-Seok. We couldn't find a single photo of a wedding. You'd think the world would have noticed." "Some men buy billboards to prove they are loved," Joon-Seok replied, his eyes narrowing just enough to let her see the edge of the blade beneath his tongue. "I buy silence. It is much more expensive and far more loyal." He didn't just defend me, he dismantled their reality. He answered every invasive question with a precision that made our life feel more solid than the marble floor beneath us. He spoke of a whirlwind romance in Seoul, and of a woman who was too much for anyone else because she was exactly enough for him. By the time the first course was served, my family wasn't looking for lies anymore. They were looking for favor. They were terrified of the power I now seemed to command. I watched them scramble to impress the man who was holding my hand under the table, his thumb tracing slow, possessive circles against my palm. The difficult daughter was gone. In her place sat a woman they no longer understood, protected by a man who made it clear that to touch me was to invite a war. The shift in the room was instantaneous. One moment, Joon-Seok was the charming, billionaire husband, playing the role of the devoted lover with a precision that had my mother and sister retreating in silent defeat. The next, a man in a dark, nondescript suit approached our table. He didn't wait for an introduction. He simply leaned down and whispered 3 words into Joon-Seok's ear. The transformation was chilling. The warmth he had been projecting, the soft gaze, the gentle thumb circles on my hand, evaporated. His body went rigid, settling into a lethal, frozen stillness. The hand that had been holding mine didn't let go, but the grip changed. It was no longer a caress, it was a shackle. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the mahogany table. "Stay here, do not move from this seat," he commanded. It wasn't the voice of the husband he had been pretending to be for the guests. It was the voice of a man used to giving orders that carried the weight of life and death. He rose without a word of apology to my family, following the messenger toward the shadows of the darkened balcony. My mother tried to make a joke, something about busy men and their billions, but the words died in her throat as she caught a glimpse of Joon-Seok through the glass doors. The ghost of Seoul had emerged. Gone was the polished executive. On the balcony, under the dim amber lights, I saw him grab the messenger by the lapels, his face twisted into a snarl of cold fury. He looked like a man who didn't just control outcomes, but one who broke anyone who dared to interfere with them. The guests laughed and clinked glasses of expensive champagne, oblivious to the fact that the man they had been admiring was currently radiating a darkness that made the night outside look bright. I sat frozen, the emerald silk of my gown suddenly feeling like a funeral shroud. I realized then that the only if condition of our contract wasn't about social etiquette. It was about security. I hadn't just hired an actor to save my reputation. I had invited a predator into my family's sanctuary, and the scent of blood was finally in the air. When he stepped back into the room minutes later, his expression was a mask of perfect, terrifying calm once more, but the air around him felt charged with electricity. "The next song is ours," he said, his voice dropping back into that low, velvet vibration. But as he reached for my hand, I saw a faint smear of something dark on his cuff. He wasn't asking for a dance anymore. He was reclaiming his property before the storm hit. The orchestra transitioned into a slow, haunting waltz, the minor chords vibrating through the floorboards. Joon-Seok didn't wait for my response. He pulled me from the chair, his grip firm and uncompromising, leading me toward the center of the ballroom. My family's eyes followed us, my sister, with envy, my mother, with a newfound fear. But as we reached the floor, the rest of the world seemed to fall away into a blurred periphery of silk and shadows. He turned to face me, and for the first time since the balcony incident, I looked directly into his eyes. They were obsidian pools, bottomless and unreadable. When his hand settled on my waist, it wasn't the light, courteous touch of a stranger. It was the heavy, proprietary press of a man who had just reminded the world why he was feared. He drew me in until there wasn't a breath of space between us, my emerald silk gown brushing against the rough wool of his tuxedo. "You're trembling, Naomi," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that I felt in my chest more than I heard with my ears. "You have blood on your cuff, Joon-Seok," I whispered back, my heart hammering like a trapped bird. "Who was that man? What is happening?" His lead was fluid and dominant, forcing me to follow his rhythm or fall. He spun me into the center of the room, his thumb tracing a slow, agonizingly deliberate circle against the small of my back. The touch sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the cold air from the balcony. "Focus on the dance," he commanded, his eyes locking onto mine. "Focus on the husband I am supposed to be. The rest is just noise." "Is it?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Or am I just the cover for whatever you were doing out there?" For a heartbeat, the lethal mask slipped. His gaze dropped to my lips, and his expression softened into something visceral and dangerously real. The performance ended, and for a fleeting moment, I saw the man behind the ghost of Seoul, a man who looked at me not as a contract, but as a woman who was the only fixed point in his chaotic world. The intimacy was terrifying. It was a physical weight, a pull that made me want to lean into him and forget that this was all a transaction. The line between the lie we were telling my family and the truth of the electricity between us vanished. I found myself resting my head against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of sandalwood and danger. I was supposed to be playing a part, but as the music swelled, I realized I wasn't acting anymore. I was falling for a man whose secrets could destroy me, and the scariest part was that I didn't want the song to end. Then the music stopped, but Joon-Seok didn't let go. He kept his arm around my waist, his eyes scanning the room with a sudden, sharp intensity. "Don't move," he whispered, his body tensing like a coiled spring. The sudden, sharp tensing of Joon-Seok's muscles was my only warning. Before I could ask what he saw, the heavy glass doors leading to the balcony, the same doors where he had just exerted his silent authority, shattered inward. The sound was like a bomb going off, a cacophony of crystal shards raining down on the marble floor. The room erupted into a symphony of high-pitched screams and the chaotic scraping of chairs. But Joon-Seok didn't scream. He didn't even flinch. In one fluid, blurred motion, he pivoted, his body becoming a human shield that forced me down behind a heavy mahogany buffet table. The transformation was complete. The billionaire CEO was gone, replaced entirely by a man who moved with the practiced, lethal instincts of a warlord. "Stay down, heads away from the glass." Joon-Seok's voice boomed over the panic, a command so absolute that even the terrified guests momentarily froze. From the shadows of the broken balcony, 3 figures in tactical gear stepped through the mist of dust and debris. They weren't looking for jewelry or money, their eyes were locked onto Joon-Seok. This wasn't a robbery, it was a hit. My mother and sister were huddled under a nearby table, their faces pale masks of terror as they realized the powerful man Naomi had brought home had brought a war with him. Joon-Seok reached into the waistband of his tuxedo. I didn't see the weapon until it was already leveled, a matte black handgun that looked like an extension of his own arm. "Naomi," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm amidst the chaos. He didn't look at me, his eyes never leaving the intruders. "When I say go, you crawl toward the service entrance. Do not look back, do not stop for your family, do you understand?" "I'm not leaving you," I whispered, my fingers digging into the emerald silk of my dress, now torn and stained with dust. "You signed a contract of obedience," he hissed, his gaze flickering to mine for a fraction of a second. There was no romance in his eyes now, only a cold, burning determination to keep me alive. "Follow the contract." A shot rang out, muffled and sharp, hitting a champagne tower behind us. Glass exploded in a glittering fountain of amber liquid. Joon-Seok returned fire with a precision that was chilling to witness. He wasn't just defending himself, he was controlling the space, every movement calculated to draw the fire away from where I crouched. In the midst of the tactical lockdown, I realized the horrifying truth of the high-status savior. He hadn't just saved my reputation, he had made me the most dangerous woman in the room. The smoke from the suppressed gunfire hung in the air like a bitter shroud, mixing with the scent of spilled champagne and expensive perfume. The tactical team had been neutralized or driven back into the night as quickly as they had arrived. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, Joon-Seok didn't rush to comfort me. He didn't check on my sobbing mother or my sister, who was huddled in a corner, her white dress stained with soot. Instead, he stood amidst the wreckage, holstering his weapon with a clinical detachment that made my blood run cold. He pulled a burner phone from his pocket, speaking in rapid, sharp Korean. I watched him, my heart still hammering against my ribs, waiting for the husband to return. But when he finally turned to me, the warmth he had faked all evening was gone. His eyes were as hollow as a winter sky. "The threat is contained," he said, his voice flat. "But the contract is over. My security team will escort you home." Over, I stood up, my emerald gown shredded at the hem, my natural hair disheveled. "Joon-Seok, people just tried to kill us. My family is traumatized. You can't just walk away." He looked at me then, and the look wasn't one of love, it was one of business. "Naomi, you asked me why a man like me would agree to play house for a day. You thought it was because I was intrigued by your desperation. Or perhaps you thought there was a spark." He took a step toward me, the height I once found comforting now feeling like a wall of ice. I needed a civilian cover to move through this district unnoticed by my rivals. They were looking for a ghost. They weren't looking for a man attending a middle-class wedding with his American wife. The truth hit harder than the shattered glass. I hadn't been saved, I had been a decoy, a human shield wrapped in emerald silk. The high-status savior was just a man who used people like chess pieces. My sister's wedding wasn't the main event to him, it was a tactical blind spot. "You used me," I whispered, the shame of the lobby returning, but this time it was laced with a stinging, hot anger. "I fulfilled the contract," he countered, his expression unreadable. "Your family is terrified of you, your sister will never look down on you again. You got exactly what you paid for, Naomi. I just got what I needed." He turned to leave, his silhouette framed by the broken balcony doors. He looked every bit the powerful, untouchable CEO again, but the illusion was dead. I had won the war against my family, but as I looked at the man walking away, I realized I had lost something much more valuable. The clock on the ballroom wall struck midnight, the chimes sounding like a funeral knell for the version of me that had entered this room. The guests were being ushered out by men in suits who looked far more like soldiers than valets. My family had already been spirited away in a black sedan, too shaken to even look me in the eye. I stood alone in the center of the wreckage, the emerald silk of my gown heavy with the dust of the night. I felt the weight of the silence, a hollow ache where the adrenaline used to be. The contract was officially over. I had saved my reputation, crushed my sister's ego, and silenced my mother's barbs. I was the winner of a game I no longer wanted to play. I turned to leave, my heels clicking sharply against the marble, heading toward the exit where a town car waited to return me to my quiet, lonely apartment. But as I reached the broken glass of the balcony, a hand caught my wrist. It wasn't a violent grip, but it was absolute. I didn't need to turn around to know the scent of sandalwood and cold steel. "The 24 hours are up, Joon-Seok," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my soul. "I believe I've fulfilled my unquestioning obedience. You can let go now." He didn't. Instead, he stepped into my space, forcing me to look up into those dark, unreadable eyes. The mask of the cold strategist was still there, but behind it something else flickered, a hunger or perhaps a realization. "The contract is void," he murmured, his voice dropping into that lethal, velvet frequency. "But I find myself dissatisfied with the conclusion. You are the only person who has ever looked at the monster behind the CEO and didn't run. That wasn't in the agreement, Naomi." "What do you want from me?" I whispered, my heart beginning its frantic dance once again. "You got your cover, you're safe." "I don't want a cover anymore," he said, his thumb grazing the pulse point at my wrist, mirroring the possessive touch from the dance floor. "I want the woman who had the courage to ask a predator for help. The world thinks you are my wife, Naomi. And in my world, what the public believes becomes the reality I enforce." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a new card, not silver-bordered this time but solid gold. He pressed it into my palm, his fingers lingering against mine. This isn't a contract for a day. It's an invitation to a life you never dared to imagine. You can walk to that car and go back to being the difficult daughter, or you can stay and we can show them what a real dynasty looks like. He let go of my wrist, giving me the choice he had once stripped away. I looked at the gold card, then at the man who was both my savior and my storm. The clock had struck midnight, but the fairy tale hadn't ended. It had just turned into something much more dangerous. I didn't head for the car, I turned back toward him. I hope you realize, I said, a small defiant smile touching my lips, that I am still very difficult to handle. Joon-Seok's lips quirked into the first genuine smile I had seen all night. I wouldn't have it any other way. I didn't head for the car. I turned back toward him, the emerald silk of my gown trailing across the marble like the wake of a ship. I looked into the eyes of the man who had just dismantled my old life, and for the first time I wasn't afraid of the darkness I saw there. I hope you realize, I said, a small, defiant smile touching my lips, that I am still very difficult to handle. I don't break easily. Joon-Seok's lips quirked, not into a cold, calculated smirk, but a genuine smile that reached his eyes. He reached out, his hand settling once more on the small of my back with a proprietary weight, guiding me toward a future that was no longer a transaction, but a takeover. Naomi, he whispered, I didn't choose you because you were easy. I chose you because you're the only one who can stand by my side without flinching. The contract was just the beginning. To see how Naomi survives life as the Mafia Boss's wife, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss part 2. Thank you for watching, see you on the other side.